Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about something that still haunts Hollywood 16 years later.
A story that begins with ambition and ends with a question nobody wants to answer.
What happens when an actor becomes too good at their craft? If you find value in these deep explorations, I'd appreciate your support through a like and subscription. It helps more people discover these stories that deserve to be told. January 22nd, 2008. A Tuesday afternoon in Manhattan. A masseuse arrives at a Soho apartment for a scheduled appointment. She knocks, no answer. She tries calling. The phone rings inside, but nobody picks up. After several attempts, she uses her key to enter. What she finds in the bedroom will send shockwaves through an industry that thought it understood the price of great art. Heath Ledger is lying face down on his bed.
He's not breathing.
He's 28 years old. In 6 months, the world will see what he created in his final complete performance. A portrayal so disturbing, so authentic, so utterly convincing that it will win every major acting award and change superhero cinema forever. But Heath won't be there to accept any of it. The official cause of death will be listed as acute intoxication from the combined effects of 6 different prescription medications.
An accident. That's what the medical examiner will conclude.
But that word feels insufficient when you understand what led to that moment. Heath Ledger didn't die from a simple mistake with pills. He died from succeeding too completely at something that should never have been attempted. Picture this. It's February 2007, just over a year before his death. Heath has locked himself in a London hotel room. Not for a day or two, but for an entire month. 30 days of voluntary isolation. He's preparing to play a character in a Batman film, which sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. A comic book movie. The kind of project that usually involves green screens and stunt coordinators. Not the sort of psychological excavation that Heath is about to undertake. But this isn't just any character. Christopher Nolan, the director, has reimagined the Joker as something cinema has never quite seen before. Not a gangster who fell into chemicals, not a theatrical showman in a purple suit. This Joker is a terrorist philosopher, an agent of pure chaos who's thought deeply about why nothing matters. Someone who finds genuine joy in proving that civilization is a thin veneer covering our worst impulses. To play this character convincingly, Heath has decided he needs to access something most actors wisely avoid. He needs to understand from the inside what it feels like to find meaning meaningless, to see order as illusion, to experience chaos as liberation. It's a dangerous proposition, but Heath is 27 years old and at the height of his powers. He's already proven himself with Brokeback Mountain, earning an Oscar nomination for playing Ennis Del Mar with such painful authenticity that audiences forgot they were watching acting. Now he wants to prove something bigger, that he can create the definitive screen villain, that he can make the Joker as important to cinema as Brando's Don Corleone or Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter. And he's willing to pay whatever price that requires. In that hotel room, Heath surrounds himself with darkness. Images of psychopaths cover the walls, photographs of Alex from A Clockwork Orange,
News clippings about real violence.
He's watching documentary footage of actual serial killers, studying how they speak, how they move, how they justify what they do. He's reading psychiatric case studies, immersing himself in the mindset of people who lack something fundamental that makes the rest of us human. Most importantly, he's keeping a diary. But calling it a diary makes it sound too ordinary. This is something else entirely. Page after page of the Joker's thoughts, written in first person, as though Heath is transcribing the inner monologue of someone who doesn't exist yet. Comic strips showing violence, sketches that disturb rather than illuminate, lists of things that make the Joker laugh, growing darker and more philosophical with each entry. The voice is the hardest part. Heath spends days trying different approaches. Too deep sounds like a cartoon. Too high sounds comedic. He needs something that makes audiences uncomfortable in a way they can't quite articulate. Something wrong. He finds it by accident, experimenting with the way ventriloquist dummies sound, that uncanny quality of a human voice that's slightly off. The result is a raspy, damaged quality that suggests someone who's performing being human rather than actually being human. When he finally calls Christopher Nolan to demonstrate what he's created, Nolan's response is immediate.
That's him.
Don't change anything. Heath has found the Joker, but in the process of finding the character, something else has happened. Something nobody, including Heath, fully understands yet. The boundaries that normally separate an actor from their role have started to dissolve. Most actors put on a character like a suit. They wear it for the cameras, then take it off when filming wraps. Even method actors, the ones famous for staying in character, usually maintain some internal separation. They know who they are underneath the performance. But Heath's approach to the Joker is different.
He's not putting on a character.
He's attempting to genuinely become someone whose psychology is fundamentally incompatible with human well-being. Think about what that means practically. To authentically portray someone who finds chaos beautiful, you have to make yourself find chaos beautiful. To convincingly play someone who sees meaning as illusion, you have to convince yourself that meaning is illusory. Heath is essentially conducting an experiment in psychological manipulation with himself as the subject, and he's succeeding brilliantly. Too brilliantly. His friends start noticing changes during this preparation period. The easy Australian charm that made Heath so likable begins to recede. He becomes more intense, more isolated, more difficult to reach emotionally. When people ask how the preparation is going, he'll talk enthusiastically about the work, but there's something off in his eyes, a distance that wasn't there before. Michelle Williams, his girlfriend and the mother of his daughter Matilda, tries to support Heath's process while also managing her own concerns. She's seen Heath transform for roles before, but this feels different. There's an obsessiveness to it that goes beyond professional dedication. When Heath is home, he's not fully present. Part of him remains in that London hotel room, in the Joker's headspace, unable or unwilling to fully return. To understand how Heath arrived at that hotel room in London, you need to understand who he was before the Joker consumed everything. Heath Andrew Ledger was born on April 4, 1979 in Perth, Western Australia. From the beginning, he possessed an energy that demanded outlet. His mother Sally would later recall that Heath couldn't sit still as a child. He needed to move, to create, to perform. School plays became his first stage.
Local theatre groups welcomed his enthusiasm.
But Perth, isolated on Australia's western coast, felt too small for what Heath imagined for himself. At 16, he made a decision that would define everything that followed.
He was going to be an actor.
Not as a hobby or backup plan, but as his entire life's focus. He moved to Sydney first, taking small roles in Australian television. A recurring part in a show called Sweat, guest appearances on Home and Away. The work was steady but unremarkable, the kind of credits thousands of aspiring actors accumulate while waiting for their breakthrough. But Heath had something different, an intensity that made casting directors remember him, a willingness to take risks that separated him from actors playing it safe. In 1998, at 19, Heath made the leap to Los Angeles. He arrived with minimal connections and even less money. The early months were brutal, auditions that went nowhere, rejection after rejection. Los Angeles has a way of grinding down ambition, of making talented people question whether they're talented enough. But Heath possessed something crucial for survival in that environment. He was stubborn to the point of recklessness. His breakthrough came in 1999 with 10 Things I Hate About You, a clever modernization of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew set in an American high school. Heath played Patrick Verona, the charming bad boy hired to date the untouchable Cat Stratford. The role required him to be funny, romantic, and vulnerable all at once. Heath delivered all three with an ease that made the film a surprise hit. Overnight, magazines declared him Hollywood's newest heartthrob. Teen idol status arrived with all its trappings.
Magazine covers, screaming fans,
Industry expectations that he'd continue playing charming romantic leads for the next decade. But Heath hated it. He hadn't fought his way to Hollywood to become a poster on teenage bedroom walls. He wanted respect as a serious actor, and he was willing to sacrifice commercial success to earn it. So he made a series of choices that confused his agents and frustrated studio executives. The Patriot paired him with Mel Gibson in a Revolutionary War epic where Heath played Gibson's son seeking revenge. A Knight's Tale cast him as a peasant pretending to be a knight in medieval jousting tournaments. Monsters Ball gave him a smaller role in a darker, more complex story. Each choice showed Heath deliberately moving away from the heartthrob image, trying to prove he could do more. Then came the role that would change everything about his career and his industry standing. Brokeback Mountain, directed by Ang Lee, told the story of two cowboys who develop a romantic relationship spanning decades, hiding their love from families and society. In 2005, playing a gay character remained controversial for leading men. Heath's representatives strongly advised against it. Conservative audiences would reject him. His action movie prospects would vanish. The teenage girls who made him famous would abandon him. Heath took the role anyway. His portrayal of Ennis Del Mar, a deeply repressed man struggling with emotions he can't express or fully acknowledge, earned universal critical acclaim. The Academy nominated him for Best Actor. At 26, he'd proven himself capable of work that matched any actor in his generation. The heartthrob label no longer fit. Heath Ledger had become a respected artist, but with that respect came a new kind of pressure. He demonstrated his range and his willingness to take risks. Industry insiders started wondering what he'd do next. What role could possibly follow Brokeback Mountain? How do you build on a performance that intimate and powerful? The answer arrived in an unexpected form. Christopher Nolan was developing a sequel to Batman Begins, his 2005 reboot of the Batman franchise. The first film had been a critical and commercial success, grounding the superhero story in gritty realism. Now Nolan needed a villain for his sequel. Not just any antagonist would suffice. He needed the Joker, Batman's ultimate adversary, reimagined for his realistic Gotham. The Joker carried enormous cultural weight. Jack Nicholson's 1989 portrayal had achieved legendary status, defining the character for an entire generation. How do you follow that? Who possesses the courage, or perhaps the necessary recklessness, to step into those shoes? Heath Ledger raised his hand. And almost immediately, the internet exploded with mockery and outrage. Heath Ledger as the Joker? The pretty boy from 10 Things I Hate About You? The guy who just played a gay cowboy? This had to be a joke. Jack Nicholson had created perfection. This casting would be a disaster. Warner Brothers executives expressed serious doubts. Online forums filled with preemptive criticism. Entertainment websites ran polls asking if Heath was the worst casting choice in superhero movie history. The backlash was swift and brutal. Heath read all of it.
saw every mocking comment, understood the skepticism, and it only made him more determined because Heath understood something the critics missed.
Playing the Joker wasn't about matching Jack Nicholson's theatrical performance. Christopher Nolan's vision required something fundamentally different. This Joker needed to feel like a genuine threat, someone who could actually exist in a realistic version of Gotham, an anarchist who rejected all social structures, a terrorist unconcerned with political ideology, someone who committed violence not for profit or power, but because he found beauty in chaos itself. Heath assembled a package of materials demonstrating his vision for the character. Disturbing artwork, references to Francis Bacon, paintings with their distorted, screaming faces, stills from A Clockwork Orange, punk rock aesthetics mixed with genuinely unsettling imagery. It wasn't a traditional audition package. It was a window into a dark, artistic vision. When Nolan saw that package, he recognized something crucial. Heath wasn't approaching this as a villain role. He was approaching it as a complete deconstruction of sanity itself. More importantly, Heath demonstrated willingness to access dark places within himself. The madness Nolan's Joker required wasn't something that could be acted superficially. It demanded genuine psychological exploration. Nolan cast Heath despite studio concerns and fan outrage, and Heath made a promise in return. He would deliver a performance unlike anything audiences had seen before.
A Joker that would redefine the character completely.
Heath took that promise with absolute seriousness, perhaps too much seriousness. Early 2007 arrived with pre-production beginning in earnest. Heath made a decision that concerned people close to him. Complete isolation in that London hotel room.
No friends, no family contact.
He even distanced himself from Michelle and Matilda. Solitude became his chosen preparation method. His reasoning made sense from an acting perspective. To become the Joker required forgetting Heath Ledger entirely. His own personality, his history, his identity, all had to be suppressed. Only by creating that psychological space could the Joker emerge fully formed. It's the kind of logic that sounds reasonable until you understand what it actually requires. Method acting, as traditionally taught, relies on emotional recall. Actors mine their own traumatic experiences, bringing up genuine pain and fear and anger, then channeling those emotions into performances. If you need to cry, you don't think about your character's fictional loss. You remember your grandmother's funeral. You make yourself actually grieve, then perform while grieving. This technique works for certain roles and certain actors, producing extraordinary results. Marlon Brando's performance in On the Waterfront drew from his own feelings of betrayal. Robert De Niro's work in Raging Bull came from accessing genuine rage. These performances feel authentic because the emotions fueling them are authentic. But there's a cost rarely discussed in acting schools. Each time you deliberately access trauma, you're reinforcing the neural pathways associated with that trauma. You're teaching your brain that this pain is something to revisit regularly. For some actors, particularly those playing extremely dark roles over extended periods, the line between accessed emotion and genuine emotional state begins to blur. Heath wasn't trained in traditional method acting. He'd never studied at the actor's studio. But he'd absorbed method principles through the culture of serious film acting, and he'd developed his own intense approach. For the Joker, that approach meant something far more extreme than emotional recall. It meant attempting to understand from the inside what it feels like to be genuinely psychopathic. Psychopathy isn't just about being mean or violent. It's a fundamental difference in how the brain processes empathy, consequences, and human connection. These aren't people choosing to be cruel. They're people who experience reality fundamentally differently from the rest of us. And Heath's research into real psychopaths wasn't academic or distanced. He was trying to inhabit that mindset. The diary Heath kept during this period reveals this process in disturbing detail. Early entries analyze psychopathic behavior clinically. Later entries are written in the Joker's voice, expressing the Joker's philosophy as though Heath himself believed it. The handwriting becomes more erratic. The content grows darker. By the end, it's genuinely unclear whether Heath is creating a character or documenting a transformation. One page that's been publicly shared shows Heath's notes on chaos. The Joker doesn't create chaos, he wrote.
He reveals it.
He shows people who they really are when the rules don't apply anymore. This is sophisticated philosophical thinking about the character, but it's also potentially dangerous thinking to internalize. If you spend months convincing yourself that social order is meaningless, that human morality is pretense, that chaos is the fundamental truth of existence, you're essentially arguing yourself into a nihilistic worldview. The transformation Heath underwent in that London hotel room went beyond normal actor preparation. He was conducting an experiment in controlled psychological manipulation, though the control part would prove illusory. Every morning, he'd wake up and immediately begin the process of forgetting himself. Not in a mystical sense, but through systematic mental practice. He'd study the images covering his walls, photographs of people whose eyes held nothing behind them, news clippings about violence performed without apparent motive. He'd read psychiatric evaluations of diagnosed psychopaths, not highlighting the clinical language, but the direct quotes. The way these people described their worldview, how they justified their actions, what they found amusing. The work consumed him completely. Friends who managed to reach him by phone during this period described conversations that felt off. Heath would talk about the Joker in present tense, as though the character already existed independently. He'd describe what the Joker would find funny about current events, what the Joker would think about various situations. It wasn't Heath analyzing a fictional character. It was Heath channeling a presence he was bringing into being. The voice breakthrough came after 2 weeks of frustration. Heath had been trying different vocal approaches for days. He'd record himself, listen back, delete everything. Too theatrical, too obviously performed. He needed something that felt organic to the character. That seemed to emerge from the Joker's psychology rather than being imposed on it. Late one night, exhausted from another failed attempt, Heath started playing with the idea of damage. What if the Joker's voice reflected someone who'd been physically or psychologically damaged?
Not in an obvious way, but subtly wrong.
He experimented with a raspy quality, as though the vocal cords themselves were scarred, a breathless delivery that suggested manic energy barely contained. The tongue movements that would become the character's signature tic started as a practical solution to the prosthetic scars interfering with the makeup. But Heath recognized their disturbing quality and incorporated them deliberately. When he demonstrated this voice for Nolan over the phone, the director's immediate approval validated everything Heath had been doing. But that validation also removed any guardrails. If Nolan loved what Heath was creating, then Heath would push even deeper. There was no reason to hold back, no suggestion that maybe he was going too far. The physical transformation happened simultaneously. Heath stopped eating regularly, dropping weight until his face looked gaunt and hollow. He'd study himself in the mirror, watching how the changed appearance affected his own perception. The person looking back increasingly didn't resemble Heath Ledger. It resembled something else, something disturbing. He developed a walk for the character. Not the confident stride of a typical villain, but something more unsettling.
A slight hunch.
Weight on the balls of his feet, always ready to move unpredictably. No wasted motion, but also no normal social awareness of personal space. The Joker would invade people's bubbles without seeming to notice or care. But the most dangerous part of Heath's preparation was the philosophical work. The Joker isn't just evil in a simple, straightforward way. Nolan's version is someone who's thought deeply about why nothing matters, who's developed a coherent worldview based on nihilistic principles, who can articulate his philosophy in ways that sound almost persuasive. Heath spent hours writing the Joker's thoughts on meaning, order, chaos, and human nature. These weren't lines from the script. They were Heath's attempts to build a complete psychology for the character, and to make that psychology convincing, Heath had to find its internal logic. He had to make the Joker's worldview make sense, at least temporarily, to himself. This is where the danger really began, because when you argue yourself into believing that meaning is illusory, even as an intellectual exercise for a role, you're affecting your brain chemistry. You're creating thought patterns that can become self-reinforcing. The more you think these thoughts, the easier they become to think, which means you think them more often. Heath emerged from that month of isolation, having created exactly what he intended. The Joker existed now, fully formed, not as words on a page, but as a living entity that Heath could access completely. The voice was there. The physicality was there. The psychology was there. Everything was ready. But here's what nobody understood, including Heath. He hadn't just created a character he could perform. He'd built a psychological construct that would prove very difficult to dismiss when the cameras stopped rolling. The Joker had been given too much life, too much internal consistency, too much authentic psychology. Heath had succeeded in making the character real, and real things don't simply disappear when you want them to. When Heath returned to the United States in March 2007, his friends and family noticed the change immediately. Michelle tried to reconnect with the man she loved, but that man seemed partially absent. Heath was there physically, present for Matilda, engaged with daily life. But there was a quality to his attention that felt different, as though part of his consciousness remained elsewhere, still in dialogue with the character he'd created. His sister Kate flew from Australia to visit before filming began. She spent a week with Heath and came away deeply concerned. In a phone call to their parents, she described Heath as obsessed, not in a casual way, but genuinely fixated on the Joker to the exclusion of almost everything else. He talked about the character constantly, worried about whether he'd be able to maintain the intensity he'd achieved in isolation once filming began. Kate asked Heath directly if he was okay, if this preparation was healthy. Heath's response was telling. He said he was scared. Not of failing, but of what he'd found while looking for the Joker. He said he'd gone to some really dark places. Then he said something Kate would never forget. He hoped he could find his way back. That statement, made months before his death, reveals that Heath had some awareness of what he was doing to himself. He recognized the psychological risk, but he was committed to the performance, and the risk seemed worth it. After all, this was his chance to create something legendary, to prove that he belonged in the conversation with the greatest actors of his generation. Surely that justified temporary psychological discomfort. This is the lie that killed Heath Ledger. The belief that you can access disturbing psychological states temporarily, that you can dive as deep as necessary for a role, then simply resurface when the work is done. It's a comforting fiction that allows actors to justify extreme preparation, but it's not how brains actually work. When Heath walked onto the set of The Dark Knight in April 2007, he was carrying something that most actors never create and can never fully control. A character so psychologically complete, so internally consistent, so thoroughly developed that it had achieved a kind of autonomy. The Joker wasn't something Heath performed. It was something that lived inside him now, sharing space with his own consciousness. Principal photography for The Dark Knight began in Chicago in April 2007. The production was massive by any standard. Christopher Nolan had secured a budget exceeding $180 million and creative freedom rare for franchise filmmaking. Warner Brothers, seeing the success of Batman Begins, trusted Nolan's vision. The stakes couldn't be higher. Christian Bale arrived having already established his version of Batman in the first film. He knew what he was doing, understood his character's psychology, felt confident in his approach. But when Heath showed up for their first day of filming together, everything Bale thought he understood about acting intensity got recalibrated. Heath arrived on set transformed. The weight loss was immediately apparent. His face looked almost skeletal under the harsh production lights, but the physical change paled compared to the energy emanating from him. Cast and crew members who'd worked with Heath on previous films struggled to reconcile the easygoing Australian actor they remembered with the intense, focused presence now inhabiting the set. The makeup process became part of Heath's ritual. Most actors would sit in a chair while professionals applied their character's look. Heath insisted on doing most of the work himself. Each morning, he'd sit before a mirror and apply the white face paint, the blackened eyes, the grotesque red smile. It wasn't about control or ego. It was about the transformation itself. Watching Heath Ledger disappear, watching the Joker emerge, Nolan had scheduled the film's production strategically. But this created an unexpected problem for Heath. The Joker's scenes were scattered throughout the shooting schedule, which meant Heath would need to access the character repeatedly over several months, dropping in and out of that psychological space. For most actors playing most roles, this approach works fine. But Heath had created something that wasn't meant to be accessed casually. The bank robbery sequence was shot early in production. It opens the film and needed to establish the Joker as a different kind of criminal. Smart, ruthless, always several steps ahead. The scene requires the Joker to systematically betray and kill his accomplices, revealing he'd planned their deaths from the beginning. It's cold, calculated, performed with almost cheerful efficiency. Heath approached the scene with meticulous preparation. He'd mapped every movement, every gesture, every vocal inflection. But when cameras rolled, something spontaneous happened. As the Joker walks away from the bank, Heath added a little skip in his step, almost childlike, completely at odds with the violence just committed. Nolan kept that take because it perfectly captured the Joker's twisted psychology. This was someone who found genuine joy in chaos. Between takes, Heath stayed partially in character, not in an aggressive way, not demanding others call him Joker. But he wouldn't fully drop the energy. He'd sit in corners, skateboarding around the set in full makeup, muttering to himself. Other actors found it unnerving. This incredibly disturbing character casually rolling past craft services, grabbing coffee, the contrast creating a surreal disconnect. Michael Caine, playing Alfred, had perhaps the most revealing reaction to Heath's work. In the fundraiser scene, where the Joker crashes Bruce Wayne's party, Caine's character has a direct encounter with the villain. It's meant to be tense and threatening. What nobody expected was Caine's genuine reaction. Years later, Caine admitted that when Heath came through that door in character, he forgot his lines completely. Not because he was impressed by good acting, but because he was genuinely frightened. That wasn't a performance Heath was giving. It was something else entirely. Something that made a veteran actor with 50 years of experience actually afraid. The hospital scene showcased another dimension of Heath's approach. The Joker visits Harvey Dent after his transformation into Two-Face, gently pushing him toward embracing chaos and revenge. Heath played it with unexpected tenderness.
The nurse disguise,
the gentle touches, the reasonable tone explaining unreasonable philosophy. It made the Joker more disturbing, not less. Here was someone who could modulate behavior, who understood emotional manipulation. Aaron Eckhart, playing Harvey Dent, described filming that scene as one of the most intense acting experiences of his career. Heath was right in his face, and Eckhart could see that Heath wasn't fully present. Part of him was still the professional actor hitting marks, but another part was somewhere else, fully absorbed into the character. It felt like acting opposite someone genuinely unstable. The interrogation scene between Batman and the Joker became legendary for its physical intensity. Batman loses control, beating the Joker to extract information about hostages. It's brutal and raw. Much of that rawness came from Heath's commitment to making it feel authentic. Christian Bale has discussed how Heath encouraged him to actually make contact during takes, not stage combat with pulled punches, but real impact. Heath wanted Batman's desperation and rage to feel genuine, and he believed that required actual physical intensity. Bale was hesitant, worried about hurting Heath, but Heath insisted. The result is a scene that feels genuinely violent and uncontrolled. The Joker's laughter during that beating was perhaps Heath's most disturbing creation. Not a cartoon villain laugh, but something broken and genuine. The Joker finds Batman's violence hilarious not because he's immune to pain, but because it proves his point.
Even the hero becomes a thug when pushed hard enough.
The rules mean nothing.
Everyone's capable of cruelty.
Heath made that laughter chilling because it expressed philosophical validation, not triumph. But the toll this intensity was taking on Heath became increasingly apparent to those paying attention. The physical exhaustion was obvious. Heath had lost somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. His face looked hollow. The energy that once seemed boundless now appeared feverish rather than healthy. He was running on adrenaline and obsession, pushing through sheer will. More concerning were the psychological signs. Heath had always been social on previous sets, joking with crew, making friends, keeping atmosphere light between takes. During Dark Knight filming, he was isolated. Not unfriendly, but distant, living inside his own head. Several crew members noticed Heath talking to himself during quiet moments, and it wasn't clear if he was rehearsing lines or if the Joker's internal monologue had become his internal monologue. The sleep issues that would eventually prove fatal began manifesting noticeably during this period. Heath confided in Nolan about having trouble shutting his mind off at night. Nolan suggested taking a few days off to rest and reset. Heath refused. He worried that if he fully dropped out of character, he might not be able to recapture the same intensity. The Joker demanded constant maintenance. There's behind-the-scenes footage that captures something revealing. Heath sits alone between takes, still in full makeup. The camera operator is testing equipment and catches Heath unaware. For about 15 seconds we see him when he doesn't know he's being watched. His face, even under the makeup, looks exhausted and lost. Then someone calls his name, and immediately the Joker energy returns. He springs up, ready to perform. Those 15 seconds show the toll more clearly than any interview. In that unguarded moment, Heath looked like someone who desperately needed rest but couldn't access it. Someone who'd given everything to create something extraordinary and didn't have reserves left for himself. His relationship with Michelle Williams was deteriorating under these pressures. They'd been together since Brokeback Mountain, built a life together, had Matilda. But Heath's commitment to the Joker was consuming time and energy he'd normally devote to family. Michelle later spoke carefully about this period, acknowledging that Heath had become someone she struggled to reach. He was there physically, but mentally somewhere else, somewhere dark that she couldn't access or help him navigate. The film wrapped principal photography in September 2007. For most actors, this is when relief arrives. The hard work is done. Now comes post-production, some press interviews, moving on to the next project. But Heath couldn't let go. Part of his inability to disengage was professional. He'd invested so much in the performance that he wanted to ensure it came across properly in the final edit. He stayed involved in post-production, consulting with Nolan about pacing and which takes to use. More troubling was that Heath seemed unable to fully drop the Joker's mannerisms even when cameras stopped rolling. The voice would slip through occasionally. The laugh would emerge unexpectedly. Friends noticed Heath's sense of humor had gotten darker, more cynical. He'd make observations about human nature that sounded more like the Joker's philosophy than Heath's typical worldview. In October 2007, Heath and Michelle officially separated. The announcement was kept quiet, framed as an amicable decision by two people who'd grown apart. But people close to the couple knew the truth. The Joker had driven a wedge between them, not intentionally or maliciously, but simply by consuming so much of Heath that there wasn't enough left over for maintaining a relationship. Heath moved into an apartment in Brooklyn, alone, which was exactly what he shouldn't have been. Isolation had helped him create the Joker. Now isolation was trapping him with the character's lingering psychological residue. Without anyone to anchor him, no family routine to pull him back toward normalcy, Heath drifted in a space between himself and the role he'd inhabited so completely. He tried moving forward. In November, he began filming The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus with director Terry Gilliam. It was meant to be lighter, more fantastical.
A chance to cleanse his palate after the Joker's darkness.
But Gilliam noticed Heath seemed scattered, unfocused. He'd nail scenes brilliantly, then seemed confused about what came next. The sharp, prepared actor Gilliam had hired seemed to be operating on muscle memory rather than genuine engagement. The insomnia was intensifying. Heath openly discussed it in interviews that November, describing how his mind wouldn't stop racing. "Last week I probably slept an average of 2 hours a night," he told one journalist.
I couldn't stop thinking. My body was exhausted and my mind was still going.
He was taking multiple sleep medications, sometimes combining them in ways his doctors wouldn't have recommended if they'd known the full picture. What
Heath didn't fully grasp was that he'd fundamentally
altered his brain chemistry through months of accessing dark emotions and flooding his system with stress hormones. When you train your mind to think like a psychopath for professional purposes, there are neurological consequences. The brain doesn't distinguish between genuine trauma and performed trauma. On a chemical level, Heath had traumatized himself, and trauma doesn't simply disappear when filming wraps. January 2008 began with Heath Ledger trying to construct something resembling normalcy. He'd rented a loft apartment in Soho, a fourth-floor space with tall windows and exposed brick. The neighborhood suited him, artistic and unpretentious, full of people who wouldn't bother a celebrity buying coffee. He decorated sparsely, keeping the space minimal. It looked temporary because in Heath's mind, everything felt temporary now. Matilda would visit on weekends. Those were the good days, when Heath could focus entirely on being a father. He'd take her to parks, to children's museums, immersing himself in her world of imagination and simple joy. Friends who saw Heath during these visits said he seemed most like himself when Matilda was around. The darkness receded temporarily. The exhaustion lifted. He could laugh genuinely, not with the Joker's broken cackle, but with real happiness. But when Matilda left to return to Michelle, the apartment felt cavernous. The silence became oppressive. Heath's mind would begin racing again, filling the quiet with thoughts he couldn't control. The Joker's voice still echoed at unexpected moments. Ideas for scenes they'd already filmed months ago would occur to him at 3 in the morning. The character he'd worked so hard to create wouldn't leave him alone. He was seeing doctors regularly now, trying to manage the insomnia through medical intervention. The prescriptions accumulated.
Ambien for sleep, Lunesta when Ambien didn't work,
Xanax for anxiety that was becoming constant,
Valium as backup,
pain medications for lingering pneumonia he couldn't shake, each doctor prescribed without full knowledge of what others had given him. Heath didn't intentionally hide information. He simply saw different specialists for different issues, and the medical system failed to coordinate his care. Friends who visited the apartment noticed pill bottles scattered around.
on his nightstand,
In the bathroom,
on kitchen counters.
they'd ask if Heath was being careful, if he understood the dangers of mixing medications. Heath would wave off concerns. He insisted he was following instructions, that he just needed to sleep. But the definition of following instructions had become flexible. When one pill didn't work, he'd try another. If he woke after 3 hours, he'd take something else to get back to sleep. The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus filming required Heath to travel back to London in mid-January. Terry Gilliam, the director, was an old friend. They'd wanted to work together for years, and this fantastical project seemed perfect. The film involved characters traveling between reality and imagination, a fitting metaphor for an actor's life. Heath was playing Tony, a charming con man with mysterious past. It should have been fun, a return to lighter material, but Gilliam could see Heath struggling. They'd work for hours on a scene. Heath would deliver brilliantly, then seem confused about what they'd just accomplished. It was like he was there and not there simultaneously, Gilliam later recalled. The brilliance remained, the talent hadn't diminished, but there was a disconnect. Like part of Heath's mind was somewhere else, dealing with things nobody else could see. During breaks, Heath would disappear to his trailer. Cast members assumed he was resting, preparing for the next scene. But Heath's assistant knew the truth. He was trying desperately to sleep, lying down between takes, taking medication, but unable to turn off his mind. The racing thoughts had become constant, not just about work or the Joker. Everything seemed to connect to everything else in spirals of anxiety and analysis that led nowhere. Back in New York by late January, Heath attempted establishing a routine. Wake up late since sleeping at night was impossible. Spend time with friends when he had energy. Try to exercise, though constant fatigue made it difficult. See his doctors.
Take his medications.
Wait for sleep that wouldn't come. His sister Kate was worried enough that she flew from Australia to visit. She spent several days with Heath, and what she saw alarmed her. The apartment was messy, unusual for Heath, who typically kept his space organized. The refrigerator was nearly empty. Pill bottles were everywhere, not just in the bathroom but scattered throughout the apartment. Heath seemed to have lost track of his own medication schedule. Kate tried talking to Heath about getting more comprehensive help, maybe checking into a facility where doctors could properly manage his medications and monitor his sleep. Heath refused. He didn't want that kind of attention. He was embarrassed by how out of control things had gotten. Part of him still believed he could handle it himself, that he just needed a few good nights of sleep and everything would reset. They talked about the Joker during Kate's visit. Heath admitted the role had taken more out of him than expected.
"I gave everything to that character," he told her, "and I don't think I got all of myself back."
But he also expressed pride in what he'd created. Early word about the performance was extraordinary. People who'd seen the film in test screenings said Heath had done something unprecedented. "Maybe it was worth it," Heath said. "Maybe that's what great art costs." Kate wanted to stay longer, but she had responsibilities back in Australia. Before leaving, she made Heath promise to be careful with his medications, to call her every day, to reach out if he needed help. Heath promised. He meant it when he said it. But promises are hard to keep when your brain chemistry is fundamentally disrupted and you're living alone with thoughts that won't stop racing. January 21st was a Monday. Heath had a massage scheduled for the next afternoon, something to help with persistent pain from his pneumonia and the tension he carried constantly. He spent the day relatively normally by his new standards, talked to friends on the phone, made plans for Matilda's upcoming birthday, watched some television.
Tried to sleep around midnight.
Couldn't. What happened in those early morning hours of January 22nd will never be fully known. What we know from the autopsy is that by morning, his system contained 6 different prescription drugs: oxycodone and hydrocodone for pain, diazepam, temazepam, and alprazolam for anxiety and sleep, doxylamine, an over-the-counter sleep aid.
None in lethal doses individually.
But combined, they created a synergistic effect that suppressed his respiratory system. Heath Ledger stopped breathing sometime in those dark hours before dawn.
Alone in his apartment.
Finally, tragically, able to rest. The masseuse arrived at 2:45 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. She'd worked with Heath before, knew he often ran late or forgot appointments. She knocked, got no answer, called his cell phone. It rang inside the apartment. That was concerning. She called Heath's assistant, who had keys. They entered together at 3:26 p.m. Heath was in his bedroom, lying face down on the bed, wearing only underwear.
He wasn't moving.
The masseuse, trained in CPR, immediately checked for breathing. For a pulse, nothing. She called 911 while Heath's assistant tried performing CPR. The 911 call, later released publicly, captured the panic and confusion. "He's not breathing. We need an ambulance immediately." Paramedics arrived within minutes. They attempted resuscitation, following every protocol with professional efficiency. But it was clear Heath had been dead for hours. His body was cold. Rigor mortis had begun. At 3:36 p.m., Heath Ledger was officially pronounced dead. He was 28 years old. News broke quickly in the age of internet journalism. TMZ had the story within an hour. By evening, Heath Ledger's death dominated global headlines. The initial reports were vague about cause of death, leading to immediate speculation.
Suicide, drug overdose?
How does a seemingly healthy 28-year-old actor simply stop existing? The NYPD treated it as a potential crime scene initially, standard procedure for unexpected deaths. Detectives searched the apartment, photographed everything, collected evidence. What they found painted a picture not of intentional self-harm, but of someone desperately trying to manage severe insomnia who accidentally took a fatal combination of medications. There was no suicide note, no signs of illegal drugs, just prescription bottles, all legally prescribed, all with Heath's name on them. The problem was there were too many prescriptions from too many doctors, and nobody had been monitoring the cumulative effect. The world's reaction was immediate and profound. Heath's death felt impossible. He was young, talented, seemingly at the peak of his career. The Dark Knight was months from release.
Oscar buzz was building.
Everything ahead should have been triumph. Instead, there was devastating loss. In Hollywood, the response mixed shock with guilt. Everyone had seen Heath's dedication to the Joker. Many had praised his commitment, his willingness to access dark places for his art. Now that commitment felt dangerous. Had the industry celebrated something that should have raised alarms? Had everyone been so focused on the performance that they missed the performer's suffering? Christian Bale released a statement capturing the prevailing emotion. Heath was a friend. More than that, he was a brilliant actor who gave everything to his craft. Too young, too talented, too beautiful. This is a tragedy beyond words. Jack Nicholson, who'd played the Joker in 1989, made a cryptic comment to reporters that would fuel speculation for years.
I warned him.
When pressed about what he meant, Nicholson wouldn't elaborate. Some interpreted it as Nicholson having personally cautioned Heath about the role's psychological dangers. Others thought it was a general statement about the risks of method acting. Nicholson never clarified, leaving the comment to haunt discussions about Heath's death. Michelle Williams was devastated. She released a brief statement asking for privacy, particularly for Matilda's sake. Please respect our need to grieve quietly. But those close to her knew the guilt she felt.
Should she have done more?
Could she have saved him if they'd still been together? The questions without answers that torment survivors of any sudden death. Christopher Nolan felt a different kind of responsibility. He'd pushed Heath toward this performance, had recognized and encouraged the intensity Heath brought to the Joker. In a statement, Nolan wrote that Heath was a true original, completely committed to every role, but the Joker was something special. He created a character that will live forever in cinema. I only wish he could be here to see the impact of what he created. That last sentence contained layers of meaning. Nolan wished Heath could see the acclaim, yes. But there was also the implication that maybe Heath's absence was connected to the creation itself, that the performance and the death couldn't be fully separated. The autopsy results took several weeks. During that time, speculation ran wild. Tabloids pushed suicide narratives, depression storylines, secret drug addictions. They were all wrong, but that didn't stop the stories. Heath's family had to grieve publicly, while also fighting misinformation about how he died. On February 6, 2008, the New York City Medical Examiner released the official cause of death: acute intoxication due to the combined effects of oxycodone, hydrocodone, diazepam, temazepam, alprazolam, and doxylamine. The manner of death was ruled accidental. There was no evidence of suicide, no evidence of illegal drug use, no evidence of intentional overdose. Heath had been trying to sleep.
That's what killed him.
The desperate pursuit of rest that his mind, trained to access dark places for months, wouldn't allow. He'd taken medications prescribed by different doctors who didn't know about each other's prescriptions. The combination suppressed his breathing until he stopped. It was accidental, but it was also preventable. The question that haunted everyone who knew Heath was simple and unanswerable. Did the Joker kill Heath Ledger? Not directly, not literally. But did the psychological toll of inhabiting that character for so long create the conditions that led to his death? Did the sleeplessness, the racing thoughts, the inability to turn off his mind, did all of that stem from the months spent thinking like a psychopath? There's no definitive answer. Mental health and brain chemistry are complex. Heath had other stresses beyond the Joker. His relationship with Michelle had ended. He was dealing with pressures of fame and expectations. He had a young daughter he desperately wanted to be present for, but struggled to connect with while so exhausted. But anyone who worked on The Dark Knight, anyone who saw Heath during and after filming, understood that something fundamental had shifted. The Heath who went into that hotel room in London to create the Joker was different from the Heath who emerged. The process had changed him, and he never fully recovered. The film was set to release in July 2008, 6 months after Heath's death. Warner Brothers faced a difficult decision: delay the release out of respect, or proceed as planned, allowing Heath's final complete performance to be seen. They chose to proceed, but with sensitivity. The marketing emphasized the entire cast, not just Heath. There would be no exploitation of his death for ticket sales, but everyone knew the truth. The Dark Knight had become more than a summer blockbuster. It was Heath Ledger's legacy, his final statement as an artist. And audiences would be watching not just to see a great villain, but to understand what had consumed the last months of his life. The Dark Knight premiered on July 14, 2008 in New York City. It was a bittersweet event, celebrating an extraordinary film while mourning the absence of one of its stars. Christian Bale walked the red carpet looking somber. Christopher Nolan gave interviews where he carefully praised Heath's work while deflecting questions about whether the role had been too demanding. Aaron Eckhart, Maggie Gyllenhaal, and Michael Caine all attended, clearly affected by the weight of the moment. Michelle Williams did not attend. She was home with Matilda, shielding her daughter from the media circus, trying to process her own grief away from cameras. Heath's parents, Kim and Sally Ledger, flew in from Australia. They'd seen the film at a private screening weeks earlier and knew what the world was about to witness. Their son's final complete performance, a masterpiece built on methods that may have cost him everything. When the lights dimmed and the film began, the audience was electric with anticipation. But that energy shifted the moment Heath appeared on screen. The bank robbery sequence showcased the Joker as a criminal mastermind, systematically eliminating his accomplices. But it was Heath's physicality, that distinctive voice, the unsettling mannerisms, that immediately signaled something unprecedented was happening. As the film progressed, Heath's Joker dominated in ways that went beyond typical villain performances. This wasn't scene-stealing or showboating. It was complete inhabitation. Every gesture felt spontaneous yet purposeful. Every line reading contained layers of meaning. The Joker's philosophy of chaos wasn't just dialogue. It was a worldview that Heath had clearly internalized and was expressing through every fiber of his being. The interrogation scene hit particularly hard. Watching Heath's Joker laugh while being beaten by Batman, the manic joy mixed with genuine insight into human nature, it was uncomfortable in the best and worst ways. This was a villain who understood people better than they understood themselves, who saw through society's pretenses and found them hilarious. Heath made you believe in the Joker's worldview, even as it repulsed you. When the credits rolled, the theatre erupted in applause. But it wasn't typical reaction to a summer blockbuster. This applause felt like something else. Recognition of extraordinary artistry, yes, but also grief, appreciation mixed with loss. Everyone in that theatre understood they'd witnessed something rare and unrepeatable. And they understood the cost had been unconscionably high. The reviews were immediate and unanimous. This wasn't just a good comic book movie. This was cinema, and Heath's performance was being called one of the greatest villain portrayals in film history. The New York Times review captured the prevailing sentiment. Heath Ledger magically and mysteriously disappears beneath the white pancake makeup. It's a great screen performance, as good as the best, of Marlon Brando and Sean Penn. Comparisons to Brando were significant. Brando had revolutionized screen acting in the 1950s with his naturalistic approach, bringing raw authenticity that changed what audiences expected from performers. Heath, the reviews suggested, had done something equally revolutionary. He'd taken a character that should have been cartoonish and made him terrifyingly real. The film shattered box office records. Opening weekend brought in over $158 million, unprecedented for the time. Within weeks, it had crossed $500 million globally. By the end of its theatrical run, The Dark Knight had earned over $1 billion worldwide. It was a cultural phenomenon dominating conversations, inspiring countless analyses about what made the Joker so compelling. But every article about the Joker inevitably became an article about Heath. His death was still too recent, too raw. Audiences couldn't separate the performance from the performer's fate. Watching the Joker's scenes felt voyeuristic, in a way nobody quite knew how to articulate. Were we watching acting, or were we watching someone's psychological unraveling? Where was the line between Heath's craft and Heath's suffering? The phenomenon extended beyond typical movie fandom. Psychiatric professionals began analyzing the Joker's psychology in academic papers. The character became a case study in antisocial personality disorder, in nihilistic philosophy, in the nature of chaos as ideology. And inevitably, these analyses raised questions about what Heath had put himself through to access this psychology so convincingly. As summer turned to fall, Oscar speculation began in earnest. The Academy had never given a major acting award to a performance in a superhero film. Comic book movies were considered popcorn entertainment, well-crafted perhaps, but not serious cinema worthy of Oscar recognition. Heath's performance challenged that bias directly. How could you deny that what he'd created was serious acting? But there was another complication. The Academy had complicated feelings about posthumous awards. There had been only a handful in the acting categories throughout Oscar history, and each generated controversy. Some felt it was proper recognition of great work. Others felt it was sentiment clouding judgment, awards given out of grief rather than merit. The supporting actor category that year was competitive. Robert Downey Jr. had been brilliant in Tropic Thunder. Josh Brolin gave a powerful performance in Milk. Philip Seymour's Hoffman was nominated for Doubt. Michael Shannon earned recognition for Revolutionary Road, all excellent work by respected actors. But Heath's Joker existed in a different category entirely. It wasn't competing with other performances so much as transcending the entire concept of what a supporting performance could be. The Joker was technically a supporting character in Batman's story, but Heath's portrayal made him the film's dark heart. Everything revolved around the chaos he represented. Industry insiders began predicting Heath would win, not out of sympathy, but because the performance was genuinely unmatched. But that didn't stop concerns about whether it was appropriate. Would giving Heath the Oscar be seen as exploitation? Would it turn his death into a narrative device rather than a genuine tragedy? Heath's family had to navigate these questions publicly. In interviews given sparingly and carefully, they expressed pride in Heath's work, while being clear they'd rather have their son and brother back than any amount of recognition. Sally Ledger, Heath's mother, put it simply in one interview. He was just starting to understand how good he could be. Losing him when he had so much more to give, that's the real tragedy. Meanwhile, the film industry was having a broader reckoning with method acting and actor welfare. The Screen Actors Guild began discussions about mental health resources for performers. Some directors spoke out about the need to check in with actors doing intense emotional work. Daniel Day-Lewis, the most famous method actor of his generation, gave a rare interview where he discussed the importance of having exit strategies from difficult roles. "You have to know how to come back," Day-Lewis said. "The work requires you to go to dark places sometimes, to access emotions and states of mind that aren't comfortable. But you must know how to return from those places." Heath was brilliant, but perhaps he went somewhere without mapping the return journey. This was as close as anyone prominent in the industry came to directly connecting Heath's death to the Joker role. Most people danced around it, implying connections without making explicit claims, because to say directly that the Joker killed Heath would be to acknowledge that the art form itself can be dangerous, that the methods celebrated for producing great performances can also destroy those who employ them. February 22, 2009, the Kodak Theater in Los Angeles. The 81st Academy Awards ceremony was underway, and the film industry had gathered for its annual celebration of excellence. But this year carried unusual weight. The Dark Knight had been a cultural phenomenon, earning over $1 billion and transforming superhero cinema, yet it had been controversially excluded from the Best Picture category, a snub that led to the Academy later expanding the category from 5 to 10 nominees. The supporting actor category that night held 5 worthy performances, but everyone in that auditorium already knew the winner. Heath Ledger had been nominated posthumously for his portrayal of the Joker, and the performance had so dominated cultural conversation for the past year that denying it recognition would have been unthinkable. Still, the Academy had never loved comic book movies. Giving acting's highest honor to a villain in a Batman film broke multiple precedents, and giving it to a dead actor, while not unprecedented, always sparked debate about sentiment versus merit. The question wasn't whether Heath deserved recognition. The question was whether the Academy would have the courage to make an unconventional choice. Heath's family sat in the audience. His parents, Kim and Sally, had flown from Australia, as they had for the premiere. His sister Kate was with them, along with Michelle Williams, who'd brought their daughter Matilda. The child was 3 years old now, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense the occasion's importance. The atmosphere in the theatre was charged with anticipation and grief. Everyone present had been affected by Heath's death to some degree. Hollywood is surprisingly small at its highest levels. Most people in that room had either known Heath personally or knew someone who had. His absence was palpable. When the supporting actor category was announced, presenters Ben Stiller and Natalie Portman walked on stage. The nominees were listed. Clips from each performance played on the massive screen. When Heath's clip appeared, showing the Joker's interrogation scene with Batman, the theatre went absolutely silent. Not the polite quiet of an audience watching a movie clip, but the profound silence of people witnessing something they knew was historic and tragic simultaneously. The Joker's voice filled the theatre. "You have nothing to threaten me with. Nothing to do with all your strength." Heath's performance, even in that brief clip, demonstrated why the recognition was inevitable. The intensity, the unpredictability, the absolute commitment to the character's twisted psychology, it was all there. When the clip ended, the silence continued for a beat before polite applause began. But you could feel the emotion in that applause. This wasn't just appreciation for good acting. This was grief, admiration, guilt, and loss all mixed together. Natalie Portman opened the envelope. Her face showed that she'd seen what everyone expected but still felt the weight of it.
And the Oscar goes to a pause that felt eternal. Heath Ledger, The Dark Knight. The theatre erupted.
Not just applause, but a standing ovation that rolled through the audience like a wave. Everyone stood. Actors, directors, producers, all rising to honor someone who wasn't there to receive the honor. The applause continued for nearly 2 minutes, far longer than typical Oscar reactions.
People were crying openly.
Christian Bale had tears streaming down his face. Christopher Nolan sat motionless, overwhelmed. Heath's family made their way to the stage. Kim and Sally Ledger walked with Kate between them, holding hands, trying to maintain composure in the face of impossible emotions. This should have been Heath's moment, his triumph. Instead, they were accepting on his behalf, carrying the weight of his absence alongside the honor of his achievement. When they reached the stage and Ben Stiller handed them the Oscar statuette, the moment crystallized everything about Heath's story. Here was tangible recognition of his mastery, the industry's highest honor, proof that what he'd created was genuinely extraordinary. But the person who'd created it, who'd sacrificed everything for this mastery, wasn't there to hold the award or hear the applause or know that his vision had been validated completely. Kim Ledger spoke first. His voice was thick with emotion but steady. "First of all, I'd like to thank the Academy for honoring Heath so generously. Heath was a great actor, and he loved what he did. We're very proud of him and very proud to accept this award on his behalf." The brevity was intentional. They discussed beforehand how to handle this moment. Anything too elaborate would risk breaking down completely. Kim continued, "We'd like to thank Christopher Nolan for his support throughout the filming and afterward, and to all Heath's friends and colleagues who've been so supportive to our family. This award tonight would have humbly validated Heath's quiet determination to be truly accepted by you all here, his peers within an industry he so loved." That phrase, humbly validated Heath's quiet determination, captured something essential about Heath's relationship to his craft. He wasn't an actor seeking fame or validation from audiences. He wanted respect from fellow artists, recognition from those who understood how difficult the work was. The Oscar represented exactly that. his peers acknowledging that he'd achieved mastery. Kate Ledger added a few words, her voice breaking slightly. On behalf of Heath's family, Matilda and Michelle, we'd like to thank all of you for your support. Heath would have been so honored by this. She paused, looking out at the standing audience, tears now flowing freely.
He gave everything to his craft, everything, and we're so grateful that his work will live forever. That word, everything, resonated, because it was literally true.
Heath had given everything. His sleep, his psychological health, his relationships, his sense of self, and ultimately his life. The Oscar validated that the giving hadn't been meaningless, that what he'd created justified the sacrifice in artistic terms, but it couldn't answer whether the sacrifice should have been made at all. The family left the stage to continued applause. Backstage, away from cameras, they held each other and wept. The Oscar sat on a table nearby, golden and gleaming and utterly insufficient. No award could compensate for Heath's absence. No recognition could undo the tragedy. The rest of the ceremony continued, but Heath's win cast a shadow over everything. When the In Memoriam segment played later, showing industry figures who died in the past year, Heath's image appeared to the loudest applause of any name shown. The after-parties that night had a muted quality despite the celebrations. People drank and socialized and discussed the ceremony, but conversations kept returning to Heath. Actors who'd won or been nominated found their own achievements overshadowed by the posthumous recognition, and most didn't mind. Some moments are bigger than personal career milestones. Christopher Nolan, when asked about Heath's win by reporters, spoke carefully but emotionally. Heath deserved this recognition more than anyone I've worked with. What he created was truly extraordinary.
I just wish he was here to receive it himself, to know how much his work meant to everyone.
That's the tragedy. He achieved mastery, but he's not here to experience what that mastery means. In the months and years following Heath's Oscar win, something remarkable happened within the acting community. A conversation that had been whispered privately for decades suddenly became public. Actors who'd suffered psychological damage from intense roles began speaking openly. Method acting teachers started acknowledging the technique's dark side. The industry began, slowly and imperfectly, to gather wisdom about sustainable approaches to demanding artistic work. Christian Bale was among the first to speak candidly about what working with Heath had taught him. "Heath showed me what total commitment looks like," Bale said in a 2009 interview. "But he also showed me, though I didn't recognize it at the time, what happens when commitment becomes consumption. I've tried to learn from that, to find ways to go deep without losing myself entirely." Bale described developing his own protective rituals after Heath's death.
I don't take characters home anymore.
"When I leave set, I consciously shift my thinking. I'll drive a specific route, listen to specific music, anything that creates a clear transition between the character's headspace and my own. It sounds mechanical, but it's necessary." Gary Oldman, who played Commissioner Gordon in The Dark Knight and had been a notorious method actor himself in younger years, gave a revealing interview in 2012. He discussed how he'd had to change his approach to acting after roles in the 1980s and 90s left him emotionally devastated and struggling with alcoholism. "I played some very dark people," Oldman said. Sid Vicious, Lee Harvey Oswald, a corrupt cop.
"And I would become them so completely that I couldn't find my way back to myself afterward. I'd finish a film and not know who Gary was anymore."
The drinking was partly about numbing the confusion, the sense of being lost in myself. Oldman described getting sober and developing a new approach he called technical method, a hybrid that allowed deep character work without complete psychological immersion. You use your instrument, your voice and body and emotional capacity, but you don't lose yourself. You're always aware that you're acting. Heath crossed that line. He stopped being aware he was acting and actually became the Joker. And once you truly become a character like that, coming back is almost impossible. Anthony Hopkins, whose portrayal of Hannibal Lecter had become another benchmark for villain performances, was asked repeatedly after Heath's death about his own approach to playing a psychopath. His answers consistently emphasized technical craft over psychological transformation. "I built Lecter from external elements," Hopkins explained. "The voice, the stillness, the predatory focus. But I never tried to think like a cannibal. That would be madness. I approached it as a technical challenge. How can I make the audience believe I'm capable of these things without actually accessing that psychology?" Meryl Streep contributed her perspective in a 2010 interview. She was asked about method acting and specifically about Heath's death. "I have enormous respect for method actors who do that deep psychological work," Streep said, "but it's not the only way."
"I've never believed you have to destroy yourself to create something beautiful. Acting should be additive, not destructive."
You should finish a role richer for the experience, not depleted. The wisdom gathered from acting teachers was equally revealing. Larry Moss, who'd coached many major actors, including Heath, early in his career, spoke about the responsibility teachers have to warn students about method's dangers. "Method acting is like fire," Moss said. "Incredibly useful when controlled, devastating when it gets out of control. As teachers, we have to make sure actors know how to control it." The gathered wisdom crystallized around several key principles. First, awareness. Actors needed to understand the psychological risks of deep method work and make informed choices rather than stumbling blindly into dangerous territory. Second, support. No actor should do intensive psychological work without access to professional mental health resources. Third, boundaries. Even when pursuing deep immersion, actors needed techniques for stepping out of character and returning to themselves. Fourth, monitoring. Someone should be tracking the actor's psychological state throughout demanding work. These principles sound obvious in retrospect, but they weren't common practice in 2007. They became common, or at least more discussed, because Heath's death made their absence visible and costly. The most profound wisdom came from actors who'd worked with Heath and carried forward lessons from knowing him. Anne Hathaway, who never worked with Heath but knew him socially, spoke about how his death influenced her approach to difficult roles. "Heath's death taught my generation of actors that there are limits," Hathaway said, "that you can go deep without going so deep you can't return." Jake Gyllenhaal, who'd been close friends with Heath since Brokeback Mountain, rarely spoke publicly about Heath's death. When he did, the pain was evident. "Heath taught me that talent alone isn't enough," Gyllenhaal reflected. "You need wisdom too. The wisdom to know when you're pushing too hard, when to ask for help, when to step back." He had unlimited talent, but he was young, and he didn't have the wisdom yet to protect himself from his own ambition. Joaquin Phoenix, when he took on the Joker role for the 2019 film directed by Todd Phillips, explicitly discussed learning from Heath's experience. Phoenix had his own history of intense method work and had struggled with the psychological toll of demanding roles. For his Joker, Phoenix worked with a nutritionist to manage his extreme weight loss safely, with a therapist throughout filming, and with a clear end date after which he would completely disengage from the character. "I have immense respect for what Heath created," Phoenix said before his film's release. "But I also learned from what happened to him. You can honor a character's darkness without letting it consume you. You can create something powerful while still protecting yourself." The Screen Actors Guild established new guidelines for actor welfare on set, prompted by Heath's death. Productions shooting in SAG jurisdictions were now required to provide mental health resources for actors doing psychologically intensive work. The guidelines recommended that productions budget for on-set therapists when roles involved extended portrayal of violence, trauma, or extreme psychological states. Film schools began incorporating discussions of sustainable acting practices into their curricula. NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, Yale School of Drama, and other prestigious programs started teaching not just how to access deep emotions, but how to protect yourself while doing so. Students were introduced to concepts like emotional hygiene, the practice of consciously releasing difficult emotional states after accessing them for performance. The entertainment industry's memorial to Heath isn't primarily the Oscar statue, sitting with his family in Australia. It's the ongoing conversation about actor well-being, the resources now available that weren't before, the slight but real cultural shift toward valuing sustainability alongside intensity. Heath's parents, Kim and Sally, established a foundation in Heath's name that provided support for young Australian actors pursuing careers in Hollywood. Part of the foundation's mission was education about the psychological demands of acting and resources for managing those demands safely. It was their way of ensuring Heath's death had meaning beyond tragedy. The Joker himself as a character has been reinterpreted multiple times since Heath's death. Each actor has had to grapple with Heath's shadow, finding ways to honor what he created while establishing their own distinct interpretation. And each has approached the role with more awareness of its psychological demands, more support systems in place, more understanding that brilliance doesn't require self-destruction. There's a photograph of Heath Ledger that his family treasures above all others. It wasn't taken on a red carpet or movie set. It shows Heath on a beach in Australia, probably around 2006, before the Joker consumed his life. He's smiling genuinely, not the practiced smile of publicity photos, but a real moment of joy. His hair is messy from ocean wind. His eyes are clear and present. This photograph represents something that got lost in the intensity of his final years. The simple pleasure of being alive, of experiencing moments without purpose, beyond the moment itself. Heath had that capacity once. The beach, the ocean, the wind, these things brought him joy independent of career or craft or creative achievement. Somewhere in the pursuit of the Joker, that capacity diminished. Matilda will never remember her father skateboarding through Brooklyn with her on his shoulders. She was too young when he died. Her memories of Heath are fragments, sensory impressions without narrative structure. The smell of his cologne, the sound of his laugh, the feeling of being held. These fragments are precious and insufficient, ghosts of a relationship that should have had decades to develop. Michelle Williams spoke about this once, years after Heath's death, in a moment of unusual candor. People tell me how lucky Matilda is to have Heath's films, to be able to see his talent preserved forever.
And I understand what they mean.
But she'd trade every frame of every film to have him pick her up from school one more time. The art is for the world. The person was for us. And we lost the person. The truth that emerges from Heath's story isn't simple or comfortable. He didn't die because he was weak or careless. He died because he was extraordinarily talented and utterly committed to his craft. He pursued authenticity with such dedication that the line between performance and reality disappeared. When the character you've created is so psychologically complete that it achieves a kind of autonomy, existing alongside your own consciousness, you've succeeded as an actor in ways most performers never achieve. But you've also created something that can be genuinely dangerous to your well-being. Heath Ledger set out to create the definitive screen villain. He succeeded completely. The Joker he brought to life redefined the character, influenced an entire genre, won the highest honors his profession could bestow. But that success required him to access psychological states that humans evolved to avoid. States that, once accessed repeatedly and intensively, proved impossible to fully exit. The industry continues generating intense performances that require actors to push themselves into challenging territory. This hasn't stopped despite Heath's cautionary example. Perhaps it can't stop because audiences respond to that intensity, because the marketplace rewards risk-taking, because artists themselves are drawn to the edge between control and chaos. But there are actors now who work differently, who've absorbed Heath's lesson and adjusted their approach accordingly. They pursue excellence through sustainable methods. They access depth without losing themselves. They create powerful performances while maintaining the capacity for simple joy in their actual lives. These actors prove that Heath's path, while it produced extraordinary results, wasn't the only path available. The question of whether we'd trade Heath's Joker for Heath's continued life is one his family has had to live with. For audiences, the trade seems worthwhile. We got an unforgettable performance that enriched cinema permanently. But we didn't know Heath, we didn't love him. For those who did, the calculation is different and painful. No performance, however brilliant, compensates for permanent absence. The film industry's attitude toward actors who admit struggling has begun to shift. Previously, acknowledging psychological difficulty from roles might have been seen as weakness, as unprofessionalism. Post-Heath, there's more acceptance that struggling is normal, that asking for help is smart rather than weak. Actors began speaking openly about working with therapists, about taking breaks between intense roles, about turning down projects that felt psychologically risky. The Screen Actors Guild established a hotline specifically for actors struggling with psychological effects from roles. It was used quietly, without publicity, but actors knew it existed. Having that resource, knowing support was available without judgment, made it easier for actors to recognize when they needed help and to seek it. The wisdom that emerged from Heath's story can be summarized simply. Great acting doesn't require self-destruction. It requires skill, dedication, emotional access, and courage. But it also requires wisdom, support, boundaries, and self-care. You can pursue excellence without pursuing oblivion. You can create powerful art while maintaining your humanity. You can honor your craft without sacrificing yourself to it. Heath didn't know this, or couldn't accept it, or ran out of time before he learned it. But his death taught it to everyone who came after. In that sense, his final gift to the acting community wasn't the Joker. It was the painful lesson that talent without wisdom, ambition without boundaries, dedication without self-care, these combinations can be fatal. The gathering of wisdom continues. Each actor who speaks openly about their struggles adds to the collective knowledge. Each production that prioritizes psychological safety alongside artistic excellence advances the culture change. Each young actor who learns sustainable methods rather than discovering them through personal crisis represents progress. Heath's death was senseless, preventable, and devastating. But it wasn't meaningless. The wisdom gathered from his loss has probably saved lives, certainly improved countless actors' well-being, and shifted an industry toward recognizing
that art and artists don't have to be in opposition. The
peaceful conclusion that Heath deserved but never got was the gradual decompression that should follow intense creative work, the slow return to baseline, the rediscovery of simple pleasures, the restoration of the self that had been temporarily set aside for the character. This process can take months or years depending on the role's intensity. Heath died before the process could even begin. In an alternate timeline where Heath survived that January night, the years that followed would have been difficult. The insomnia wouldn't have magically resolved. The psychological patterns created by inhabiting the Joker wouldn't have simply disappeared. But with time, with support, with distance from the character, recovery was possible. Other actors who've done similar deep work describe the recovery as gradual, requiring patience and professional help. Heath needed that time. He didn't get it. The connection to his insomnia becomes clearer through understanding what he'd done to himself psychologically. Sleep requires a kind of surrender, letting go of control, trusting that unconsciousness is safe. But if you've been thinking like someone who finds chaos and unpredictability thrilling, if you've been inhabiting a mindset where loss of control is the point, your relationship with unconsciousness becomes fraught. Sleep might have felt to Heath's Joker-influenced mind like a loss of the manic awareness that defined the character. Friends noticed Heath seemed almost resistant to sleep during the worst periods, not physically afraid but psychologically avoiding it. He'd stay up late, find reasons to remain active, take stimulants during the day, and then need sedatives at night. The pattern suggested someone avoiding something, and what he was avoiding might have been the vulnerability that sleep requires. The cultural context of 2007 and 2008 also matters. This was before widespread awareness of mental health issues in Hollywood, before movements encouraging actors to speak openly about therapy and psychological struggles. The dominant narrative was still one of toughness, of handling your problems privately, of not showing weakness. Heath came from Australian masculine culture that particularly emphasized stoicism and self-reliance. Admitting he was struggling psychologically would have felt like failure. Several people close to Heath have since expressed guilt about not intervening more forcefully. His sister Kate has spoken about wishing she'd stayed in New York longer, insisted Heath check into a facility for comprehensive care. Christopher Nolan has never directly discussed feeling responsible, but those who know him say Heath's death profoundly affected his approach to working with actors. The truth is that everyone failed Heath in small ways that accumulated into tragedy, not through malice, but through cultural blind spots and misunderstanding the severity of his situation. Hollywood has always celebrated actors who suffer for their craft. The industry rewards extremity, pays premium salaries to those willing to transform themselves physically and psychologically. But it doesn't provide adequate support for managing the aftermath of that transformation. Heath's case also reveals the limitations of the medical system in addressing problems that exist at the intersection of mental health and professional demands. His doctors treated insomnia as an isolated issue, prescribing medications without fully understanding the psychological causes. They didn't coordinate with each other, didn't have access to complete information about what other prescriptions Heath was taking. If Heath had been working in a different profession, if the insomnia and anxiety had come from typical life stress rather than method acting a psychopathic character, perhaps the medical response would have been more appropriate. But his doctors didn't understand what actors put themselves through, didn't recognize that Heath's symptoms were partly consequences of deliberate psychological experimentation. And there's a broader question here about whether certain types of art should come with medical oversight. If an actor is planning to do intensive psychological work for a role, should there be mandatory mental health professionals involved from the beginning? Should studios be required to provide therapy and monitoring as part of actor contracts for particularly demanding roles? These questions remain largely unaddressed even today. The film industry has made some changes since Heath's death. There's more awareness, more discussion, more resources available, but the fundamental dynamic remains.
Art still requires sacrifice.
Audiences still respond most powerfully to performances that feel genuinely dangerous and intense, and actors who want to reach the highest levels of their craft are still encouraged to take psychological risks that can have lasting consequences. Heath's transformation, from the actor who left for London in early 2007 to the man who died in January 2008, represents less than a year, 12 months, during which he created something extraordinary and destroyed something irreplaceable. The speed of the decline is shocking when you map it chronologically. He entered that hotel room as a healthy, ambitious actor at a career high point. He emerged having accessed something that would eventually contribute to his death. The medications he took on his final night weren't a cry for help or a deliberate attempt at self-harm. They were a practical response to an immediate problem. He needed to sleep.
His body was exhausted. His mind wouldn't stop racing.
So he took what he'd been taking, probably in combinations and doses that had worked before, not realizing that this time the interaction would be fatal. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of Heath's death. It wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the unavoidable conclusion of his approach to acting. It was a terrible accident that happened because multiple factors aligned in exactly the wrong way at exactly the wrong time. If he'd taken slightly different medications, if the doses had been slightly lower, if someone had been there to monitor him, he'd likely have survived that night and potentially gotten the comprehensive help he needed. But he was alone. The isolation that helped him create the Joker left him vulnerable when he most needed support. And the character he'd worked so hard to bring to life had taken from him the one thing that might have saved him, the ability to simply rest. Understanding this doesn't diminish Heath's achievement. If anything, it makes what he created even more remarkable because we understand the price. But it should also serve as a warning, a reminder that art has limits, that actors are human beings who can be damaged by the characters they inhabit, that the industry has a responsibility to protect those who create its greatest works. Heath Ledger died alone in a Soho apartment, but he'd been dying slowly for months before that final night, dying in increments as the Joker consumed more and more of the space where Heath used to be. By January 22nd, 2008, perhaps there wasn't enough of Heath left to fight for survival. Perhaps the part of him that wanted to live, that believed life had value and meaning, had been too thoroughly convinced otherwise. This is the deeper truth that makes Heath's story so tragic. He didn't just die from an accidental overdose. He died from giving too much of himself to something that couldn't give anything back.
Art takes.
And sometimes, when artists don't protect themselves from their own dedication, art takes everything. The evening light on a quiet theatre, empty of audiences but full of possibility, captures something about how Heath's legacy persists. His performances continue playing for new generations. The Joker remains vital and terrifying. The work endures even as the worker has become memory. In Perth, where Heath grew up and where he's buried, there's a performing arts centre that bears his name. Young actors train there, learning their craft, dreaming of careers like Heath's. Some of them study his performances. Most of them know his story, the triumph and the tragedy intertwined. They take from it what they need, which hopefully includes both inspiration and caution. The peaceful conclusion is that Heath Ledger was here. He created beauty and terror and unforgettable moments of cinema. He loved deeply and was loved deeply. He pushed himself beyond safe limits in pursuit of artistic truth. He achieved that truth and paid the ultimate price. His daughter grows up without him. His parents live with permanent grief. His friends carry his absence. His work remains brilliant and cautionary. There's no redemption arc because life doesn't provide them.
No lesson learned that makes the loss worthwhile.
Just the simple, irreducible fact that Heath existed, mattered, created, and is gone. We honor him by remembering completely, by learning what can be learned, by ensuring that other artists have support he lacked, and by appreciating what he gave without forgetting what it cost. The final image should be that beach photograph. Heath smiling with genuine joy, wind in his hair, present in his life. That person, that capacity for simple happiness, that's what we lost. Not just an actor, but a human being who could have experienced decades more sunrises, more moments with his daughter, more simple joy. The peaceful conclusion is acceptance without closure. Heath's story doesn't end neatly. It simply ends, leaving those who remain to make what meaning they can from what happened. And perhaps that's enough. To remember, to learn, to carry forward both the inspiration of his work and the warning of his fate, to ensure that the next generation of actors can pursue greatness without the same cost. If you found value in this exploration of Heath Ledger's story, of acting's possibilities and limits, of the price of artistic perfection, I hope you'll consider subscribing to continue these conversations about film, performance, and the human beings who create the art we love. Not because Heath's story needs more viewers, but because understanding stories like his helps us appreciate both the art and the artists more completely. The sun sets on empty sound stages. The work will begin again tomorrow with new actors, new stories, new attempts to capture human truth through performance. Heath's story stands as both inspiration and warning for all who follow. His brilliance shows what's possible. His tragedy shows what's at stake. Both lessons matter. Both deserve to be carried forward. Thank you for taking this journey through Heath Ledger's life, work, and legacy. May his memory continue to inspire great art while also inspiring the wisdom to create that art sustainably. May his daughter know peace. May his family find comfort in knowing his impact continues. And may all artists who walk similar paths have the support and wisdom to survive their own greatness. The story ends here, but Heath's influence continues, complex and contradictory and human just as he was.